Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly, and we're back with another East Tennessee fishing report with Ellis Ward. How you doing, Ellis?
I'm doing good, Marv. How are you?
As always, I'm just trying to stay out of trouble. So where do you see it on the water in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, it's been kind of up and down with temperatures and rainfall and flows and on both the rivers. This is I feel like I've said this is a special time of year in every couple weeks, but there is on the Watauga, for folks that don't know about it, it is a hatch that when I first saw it, it reminds me of something that you see out of a movie or a YouTube clip or something at the fly fishing film tour. So the caddis hatch that occurs on the Watauga is it's the first hatch that makes you look around and say some creative words about how many bugs there are and how many are coming off at one time. There's some sulfurs and betas and a bunch of other stuff mixed in. But the density of life that is all of a sudden here, it's not as though it occurs over a couple days. You look around and everything's moving. Every time you go under a tree, there's, you're spitting them out. You got to shake them out of your shirt. So that kicked off mid last week, and it's pretty binary. It was barely present. There were some tiny 18 to 22 black caddis, but the 16 plus tans are out, and then you'll see some of the big ones that'll be coming here in the next week. So that's the big deal. But following that and at the same time as that, and just looking at rocks, the sulfur nymphs are going from black and red to yellowy, and it's, as a tyer and someone who loves dry fly fishing, it's cool to see all these bugs that are not only up, but getting ready to come up, that are in the 14 to 18 range versus, in the winter, it's a lot of fishing the 18 on the big side, but 20s, 22s, 24s. So cool transition into spring finally.
Yeah, it's interesting. That hatch on the Watauga is pretty famous. I think Matt Green has written a couple articles about it for Fly Fisherman magazine, and it's probably the closest thing to a Mother's Day caddis hatch we have on the East Coast.
Yeah, I think that having fished on the East Coast and on the bunch of the spring creeks up in Pennsylvania, and wade fishing throughout Virginia and Maryland, and even up in Michigan, and seeing some of the crazy stuff like the hex hatch up there. I had read about the caddis hatch, and then the first year I was here, it was 6 weeks of not just full generation, but it was the auxiliary, they were doing even more. So I really wasn't seeing the big numbers. And then the second year I was here, it was that jaw dropping, all those articles made sense. It's pretty cool to witness.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the sulfurs. I was actually having a conversation with my friend Phil Awani last week, and he's sending me some sulfurs, and he's like, hey, what color are they? I was like, well, it's kind of interesting, right? Because they're not always really, yellow, right? Sometimes they're kind of a peachy color. And so I was kind of walking him through, sometimes they're a little browny, sometimes they're a little bit peachy. So looking forward to getting some of those, and we'll have to fish those together when we get together.
Yeah. Are you talking about the adults?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is pretty cool to see. And I haven't radio tagged any of the nymphs quite yet, but you see them in different colors under rocks. And I always heard about that. This river is peachy, and this river is, heck, I have a dubbing that I'm using for the caddis pupa rear ends that is called sulfur yellow, and it is chartreuse.
Yeah.
So all over the spectrum.
Yeah. And I mean, I see people tying with those like almost glow in the dark biots too, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So really cool. Got an interesting question for you, even though we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
bugs. Got a listener who wanted to get your thoughts on: are there times when it's advantageous to use a floating line instead of a sinker streamer fishing on big rivers?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about as compiling ideas on making some instructional or informative content. One of which is that streamer fishing doesn't have to be as complicated as I think it seems, and certainly it doesn't have to be as complicated as I enjoy making it, and that's just because it's my style. So with the floating line question, it's really how are you able to present a fly in a way that is, what you feel to be an effective presentation. So, I mean, obviously, lower water could be a scenario, and I'll kind of walk through what that would look like. One would be swinging something heavy, and the approach there is a little different than the typical swinging, and that's when I say heavy, I mean very negatively buoyant. So something sparse with like a tungsten head, something like that. So as you're swinging with a floating line, every time you're stripping, instead of with a sinking line, you're moving it back and forwards in the water column because your line's sinking too. It's staying in that same vertical plane of the water column. When you're doing that with a floating line, you're emphasizing the jig on that, and that can oftentimes, I mean, I talk about the kill all the time, letting your fly die, and with jig flies, it's that down and up. So that's one. Slower water where your floating line's not getting dragged on the surface really quickly. You can really emphasize the jig, and you're not going to be worried about having line getting pulled out and setting through a big bow that the river has created. Another, I think streamer fishing gets conflated in a bunch of different ways, but I consider topwater to be a version of streamer fishing, and that doesn't necessarily mean a popper. That just means a bait fish type fly that is in the first couple inches, if not on top of the water column, and being able to get a presentation and keep it up there without the fly being necessarily buoyant. You can still get you can get all of the profile and action that you'd want from below. And that's, I think, another misconception about trout is that you need to get down into their face, and it needs to be big. And if you get the right presentation and there's a fish that's willing to go, a lot of times I'm fishing positively buoyant, so flies that would be floating otherwise, and I'm fishing them on sinking line. So you could be fishing, dungeons, typical streamers like that on a floating line, and that profile from below. Most of the time, these fish, brown trout in particular, are coming up and eating either from the side or from below. Most of the times, both. They're coming in at the belly. And if your approach of sinking line and, trying to bang the bank, give it a pause, let it sink, and then move it out and have something chase it out isn't working, absolutely go with the floating line and put something in, right where you would with the typical streamer fishing, right up against the bank or structure. and, fish it the same way with fast, short strips and big kills. And that profile showing down to the fish can oftentimes be the trigger, as opposed to the fish coming out and chasing something from behind. So it's certainly something to experiment with. And floating line, it can be challenging in fast moving deep water, but it's not as though it doesn't have its place.
Yeah, as you were saying all that, I'm sitting there visualizing like a really small, like micro changer bait fish that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at today with the lake warming up, and we're getting some generation, and it's going to be pushing shad into the river, and we'll see bait balls up in where trout are, and at the transition zone down in the lake, which sort of moves as the dam release makes its way down there, they'll school up bait, lake run browns, creek browns, and striper. They'll school up bait up against the banks and blow it up. And you really can't do anything with a sinking line. I've found myself, first couple times I was fishing it, somewhat frustrated because there's no ability to keep a small fly, buoyant or not, in the zone, even if you extend your leader. So having the extra spools and popping over to a floating or a slow intermediate with a little micro changer, absolutely, a little clouds or something like that. Those like 2.5 inch micro finesse changers are deadly for this situation that I'm talking about. But yeah, in that situation, it's the only way to get that presentation.
Yeah. And folks, we love questions at the Articulate Fly. You can email them to us. You can DM us on social media. And if we use your question, I will send you some Articulate Fly swag. And we are in a drawing for 2 days of fishing with Ellis and a night at the Watauga River Lodge with Brownie. And Ellis, before I let you go meet your client, you want to let folks know how they can find you, book you, and all that kind of good stuff?
Sure. Website is elliswardflies.com. Instagram is a good way to contact me at Ellis Ward Guides. The best way to reach out, and I had a guy that we ended up talking for an hour last week. He just had some basic questions and gave him a bunch of advice. Reach out to me on my cell phone. Give me a call or text, 513-543-0019.
Well, there you go. Well, listen, folks, as it keeps warming up and we move deeper and deeper into spring, you owe it to yourself to get out there and catch a few. Tight lines, everybody. Tight lines, Ellis.
Appreciate it, Marv.